A father and son vanished on a hunting trip in the wilds of Montana. Presumed victims of a tragic accident, their disappearance left a family shattered. But 5 months later, a hiker's camera captures something that forces everyone to question everything they thought they knew about what really happened. Robert Donovan had spent 45 years learning the ways of the mountains. Every ridge, every trail, every sign of the land had been burned into his memory. There was no place he'd rather be than in the wilderness. The crisp air filling his lungs, the weight of his rifle settled comfortably against his shoulder. His life was built around nature, and so was his son, Eli. Eli was 16, an age where most kids were still figuring out who they wanted to be. But Eli had already found his passion, his calling. He had learned from his father the art of survival, how to track, how to hunt, how to live off the land. The bond between them was built on that shared love, a bond that only grew stronger as the years passed. Eli didn't need to be told how to survive in the wild. He had spent years with Robert in the mountains, and now, at 16, he was practically a carbon copy of his father in every way that mattered. It was more than just a hunting trip to them, it was tradition. Every year, like clockwork, Robert and Eli would take their weekend trip to the mountains. A break from the world, a chance to breathe, to reconnect with nature and each other. It had been planned for weeks, and it was the kind of thing they looked forward to, the simplicity of it, the silence of the forest, just father and son. Got everything? Robert had asked Eli that Friday afternoon, eyeing the gear piled in the back of the truck. I think so, Eli said with a grin, tossing a couple of extra snacks into his bag. Don't worry, I've got it covered. You might be the expert, but I'm not too bad myself. Robert laughed, ruffling his son's hair. I'll give you that. You're getting better. Just remember, this weekend's about having fun. We'll work hard, but we'll also relax. Let the mountains remind you that there's more to life than rushing through it. Eli nodded, his eyes gleaming with the same sense of purpose and adventure that his father carried. I'm ready. Let's go. The truck pulled away from their driveway, the house growing smaller in the rearview mirror, and just like that, they were gone. The usual routine. Nothing unusual, nothing to worry about. Robert's wife, Karen, had smiled at them as they drove off, waving her hand as the truck turned the corner. It was the same thing she'd seen every year, the same goodbye that had become as familiar as the mountains themselves. No one knew it then, but that moment would be the last time she'd see them, at least as she remembered them. Saturday and Sunday passed in a blur of nature. The scent of pine trees, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the call of distant birds. They were in their element, lost in the peace that only the wilderness could bring. The only thing that mattered was the hunt. Everything else was left behind. The noise of the world, the chaos of life, faded away, and for those 2 days, they were as close to the earth as they'd ever been. Robert and Eli made camp on the second night, a small fire crackling in the clearing. They sat side by side, the warmth of the fire flickering in their eyes. Eli took a sip of water from his bottle, looking up at his father, his face softening with a thought. You ever think about how much you love this place? Eli asked quietly, the question hanging in the air like a secret. Robert took a slow breath, staring into the flames. Every time we're here, this is where I feel like I can breathe, like I can finally be myself. But it's not just about the place. It's about who you're with. That's the most important thing. Family. It's always been about family. Eli nodded, his eyes distant. I feel the same. I don't know, I just want to make sure I do this right, you know? Follow in your footsteps. Robert smiled, his voice warm but steady. You'll do fine, Eli. Don't rush it. Just keep learning. And when it's your turn to lead, do it with your heart. The two sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the fire burn low, the stars unfolding above them, vast and silent. Nothing in the world felt more real than that moment. It was everything they had ever wanted, everything they had ever needed. That was Saturday. By Sunday afternoon, they were ready to head back. They had taken more than enough game, and the weather was still holding steady. It had been the perfect trip, just like every other one they'd taken. The truck was packed, and they were eager to head home. They had plans. Robert had a meeting with some fellow hunters later that week, and Eli was supposed to catch up on some schoolwork. As always, it was a mix of work and relaxation, just the way Robert liked it. Eli's voice carried over as he shut the truck door. "We good to go?" "Yeah. Let's hit the road," Robert said, pulling the truck out of the camp area. The engine rumbled to life as they drove off, heading down the winding mountain road that would take them back to the city. Sunday night came, and the truck still didn't pull into the driveway. Karen stood in the doorway watching the road, her phone in hand. The evening sky turned from purple to black, but still no sign of them. It was strange. Robert was never late, and even though the drive was long, he always called. She checked her watch. 7:30 p.m. They should have been home by now. She gave him a call. Straight to voicemail. No text. No call. No truck in sight. By 9 p.m., Karen's worry shifted into anxiety. A sinking feeling grew in her stomach as she tried again. Nothing. She went to the window, eyes scanning the street. Still no headlights. "Robert?" she whispered to herself. "What's going on?" Her hands were trembling now, and with each minute that passed, the pit in her stomach grew deeper. At 11 p.m., Karen called the police. By Monday morning, Karen couldn't shake the feeling in the pit of her stomach. The house was too quiet. The phone didn't ring, and the driveway remained empty. The minutes ticked by, each one heavier than the last. Her thoughts raced, replaying the weekend over and over. It was supposed to be just another trip. Nothing unusual. Robert had always been reliable, always home on time. But as the hours dragged on, a small voice in the back of her mind began to whisper. Something was wrong. She picked up the phone and dialed Robert's number again. The call went straight to voicemail. She tried Eli's phone, but the same thing happened. No answer. She stood by the window, staring out at the empty street. The sun was dipping behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn. The silence in the house seemed to stretch on forever, each passing minute confirming her growing unease. She had called her sister earlier, trying to calm herself, but her sister's reassurances only made her feel more frantic. She knew, deep down, that something wasn't right. By Tuesday, the police were involved. Karen had already contacted them, her voice shaking as she explained everything. The officers took down the details, asking all the usual questions. When was the last time you spoke to them? Did they have any enemies? Was there any reason they would go off the grid? But none of it made sense. Robert wasn't the type of man to disappear without a trace. He was responsible. He would have called. The search began, but at first it felt like a formality. Volunteers from the town came together, all eager to help, but deep down, Karen could sense the doubt in their voices. The park rangers combed through the trails, helicopters circled overhead, but the woods seemed to stretch endlessly, silent and indifferent. The hours turned into days. The volunteers widened their search area, but still, no sign of Robert and Eli. No clues. No tracks. No reason to explain why they hadn't returned. Each morning, Karen stood at the edge of the forest, watching as the search crews fanned out into the wilderness, praying for a glimpse of her husband, her son. But each evening they came back empty-handed. The silence from their phones, the lack of any tangible evidence, gnawed at her insides. Where were they? By Wednesday, Karen's nerves were stretched thin. The search teams had expanded further, combing areas that had once seemed too remote to bother with. The volunteers, many of them Robert's old hunting buddies, knew the mountains like the back of their hands. But even with their expertise, there was no sign of the father and son duo. No clues. No tracks. It was as if they had simply vanished. As the days passed, Karen's fear turned into frustration. The search was exhaustive, but it felt futile. She tried to hold on to hope, to believe that they'd come back, but the reality was sinking in. She had to face the possibility that they weren't coming home. Not this time. The silence from the wilderness was deafening. No one could understand why. The thought of her husband and son, lost somewhere out there, filled her with dread. They were seasoned outdoorsmen. Robert had hiked these mountains for decades. He had taught Eli how to survive in the wilderness. He would never let something happen to him. But then, why were they gone? Days stretched into weeks. The police brought in more experts. Tracking dogs, search teams with specialized equipment, but still no answers. The sense of dread that had gripped Karen in the early hours only grew with each passing day. The weeks blurred together. The town rallied around her, offering what support they could. But Karen felt more alone than ever. How could they understand? How could anyone understand the terror she was feeling as the days dragged on without a single sign of Robert or Eli? The idea that they might never come back slowly took root in her mind, but it was a thought she refused to say aloud. She couldn't. She wouldn't. Robert and Eli had to be out there somewhere. They had to be alive. But as the search wound down, Karen realized something. The search efforts were slowing. The police began to pull back, their focus shifting to other cases. The volunteers dwindled as their own lives called them back. The trail had gone cold, and no one could explain why. There were no signs of struggle, no wreckage, no footprints, no reason for the pair's disappearance. It was as though they had simply vanished into thin air. Karen refused to give up. She spent every waking moment staring at the pictures on the wall, the photographs of Robert and Eli's last moments together. Robert's broad smile, Eli's youthful enthusiasm, both of them so full of life. They didn't deserve this. They didn't deserve to disappear, to be swallowed up by the wilderness with no explanation. The silence from their phones grew louder in her mind. She couldn't stop imagining the last message she had sent to Robert. Something casual, something that now seemed so insignificant. By the time the first month had passed, Karen's resolve had begun to crack. She stopped answering phone calls. She stopped responding to the well-meaning neighbors who offered sympathy. She couldn't listen to them anymore. How could they speak of hope when her family was still out there, somewhere, lost? But as much as she hated to admit it, the thought that her husband and son might never come back slowly seeped into her thoughts. It gnawed at her, consumed her. The phone calls from the police began to sound more like routine check-ins. They had no new leads, no new evidence. The search was still ongoing, but hope was fading. And with each passing day, it felt like Robert and Eli were slipping farther and farther away. Then, 5 months later, the phone rang. The call from the police was brief, just a few words that would change everything. They had found something they couldn't explain, something that might finally shed light on Robert and Eli's fate. Karen's heart skipped a beat as the police officer mentioned a hiker's video. A simple video taken by a hiker who had been exploring the same mountains. The officer spoke with an edge of uncertainty, but the words hit her like a tidal wave. The camera footage had shown a man, wearing a green jacket much like Robert's, walking through the forest with a child. Eli. The officer mentioned it casually, almost as if it was no big deal. But to Karen, it was everything. The footage wasn't just a clue. It was the first real lead she had received since that fateful day. It was her last hope. "Do you think it's him?" she asked the officer, her voice shaking. "We can't say for sure," he replied. "But we're following up." The silence that had gripped her for 5 months was suddenly pierced by the possibility that Robert and Eli were still out there, alive. And for the first time in weeks, Karen allowed herself to feel something, hope. But that hope, she quickly learned, would come with a cost. A cost that would send her down a path darker than she ever imagined. The hiker, oblivious to the potential significance of his actions, had set out into the same mountains that Robert and Eli had disappeared into 5 months earlier. He was just another outdoor enthusiast, capturing nature through his camera lens, focused on nothing more than the majestic views around him. His camera panned over towering peaks, the lush, untouched landscape, and the deep wilderness that stretched for miles. It was the kind of footage that would end up on countless travel blogs, a serene reminder of the beauty of the world. But this time it was different. His camera, idly snapping pictures of the woods, recorded something that would change everything. A fleeting glimpse of a figure, far away in the distance. The hiker's finger moved instinctively to zoom in, not thinking much of it. But as the zoomed footage sharpened, the figure became clearer. The man was dressed in a green jacket, a silhouette moving deliberately through the trees. He walked with a slow, steady pace, as though he had no hurry to be anywhere, his head down, focused on something ahead of him. At first, the hiker didn't think much of it. He had seen plenty of people in the woods before, hunters, hikers, or park rangers doing their rounds. The man's movements didn't stand out. But as the camera zoomed in further, something changed. The features of the man became unmistakable. An angular face, a familiar build, and the unmistakable green hunting jacket that could only belong to one person. Robert Donovan. The hiker froze, his breath catching in his throat as he stared at the screen. His heart beat louder than it ever had before. The figure in the video wasn't just anyone. It was Robert Donovan, the missing man, and standing next to him, barely visible, was another smaller figure. Eli, his son. The hiker's hand trembled slightly as he lowered the camera. The realization crashed over him, as heavy as the mountain air. Robert and Eli, they were alive. He didn't know what to do with the footage. He had no idea who these people were, no idea what their disappearance had meant to anyone. But one thing was certain. This footage was proof. Proof that they weren't just lost in the wilderness, as everyone had assumed. They were out there, alive. The hiker didn't think twice. He uploaded the footage to his YouTube channel, as he had with many other videos from his time in the mountains. It was casual, just a part of his routine. A hiker's adventure, nothing more. But there was something in his gut telling him that this video wasn't just another view of the wild. It was something more, something important. Days passed, and the video lingered in the corners of the internet, unnoticed by most. Until Laura, sitting at her kitchen table in the small town of Pine Ridge, stumbled across it. She was one of the thousands who had been following the case of Robert and Eli. The entire town had been glued to the news, hoping for a breakthrough, waiting for any sign that Robert and Eli had made it out of the wilderness alive. Laura had been one of the first to put up flyers, to search the woods herself. She knew the Donovan family well. They were neighbors just a couple of streets over. She had seen Robert and Eli countless times before, their laughter echoing in the neighborhood as they worked on their truck or hiked through the nearby forest. When Laura saw the video, her heart nearly stopped. She recognized the figure in the green jacket immediately. It was Robert. There was no mistaking it. Her mind raced, trying to process what she was seeing. The video wasn't just some random footage, it was confirmation. Robert and Eli were alive. She rushed to show her husband, shaking with a mix of excitement and disbelief. "Look," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is Robert. This is him. He's alive." Her husband, still skeptical, leaned over to take a look. His eyes narrowed as he watched the footage. It didn't take long before he understood. This is them. This is Robert and Eli. He grabbed the phone, his fingers already dialing the police. Within hours, the footage had found its way to the authorities. Detective Marlowe, the lead investigator on the case, watched the video on his own phone, his stomach twisting in disbelief. The image of Robert Donovan walking through the trees was clear. Too clear. And yet, the implications were anything but simple. Marlowe immediately called in his team. They had to act fast. They weren't sure how Robert and Eli had been hiding for so long. But one thing was clear. They were still alive, and their story was far from over. Karen Donovan sat by the phone, the weight of the world on her shoulders. She had spent months dreading this moment, certain that Robert and Eli would never return. And yet, here she was, staring at her phone screen, watching the video of her husband. Alive. Tears welled in her eyes as she saw Robert's face on the screen, looking back at the camera for the briefest of moments before he turned away. She could barely believe it. For months she had imagined the worst. The endless search, the unanswered questions. But now there was proof. They weren't gone. They were still out there. Her heart swelled with hope. But that hope was quickly tempered by a new, gnawing fear. Why had they been hiding? What had happened to them? What had they been through in the wilderness? She tried calling the police, but it wasn't until the next morning that she was able to speak to Detective Marlowe directly. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that she couldn't ignore. "We've identified the location of the footage," he said. "We're preparing a team to investigate. We'll find them. But Karen, we need to know what happened. We need answers." As the investigation continued, the police were able to trace the footage to a remote area of the mountains, deep in terrain that hadn't been covered in the initial search. They had finally pinpointed the location, a part of the forest that had been overlooked, deemed too dangerous and difficult to reach. The place where Robert and Eli had been hiding, the place they had stayed in secret for 5 months. The police pushed forward, their urgency growing with each new revelation. They were getting closer. And just as they did, Karen's hope soared. It felt like the end of a nightmare was within reach. But the moment they found Robert, everything changed. It was Robert's face that haunted her the most. When she saw him again, after 5 months of silence, it wasn't the reunion she had imagined. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt and weathered. His clothes were dirty, torn from weeks of survival, and his once warm smile was absent. The man she had loved for so long seemed like a stranger. Karen rushed to him, relief flooding through her veins. But her joy was quickly replaced by confusion and fear. "Robert," she whispered, reaching out to touch his face. "Where's Eli? Where is he?" Robert didn't speak at first. His eyes welled with tears, his face crumpling under the weight of a guilt that Karen couldn't understand. I couldn't," he murmured through the tears, his voice breaking. "Please, forgive me." Karen's heart raced. "What do you mean? What happened? Where's Eli?" Robert could only sob in response, his body shaking with the depth of his grief. And then, the truth began to surface. Slowly, reluctantly, like a poison seeping through the cracks. The police had to go back to the place where they had found Robert. And this time, they weren't leaving until they had all the answers. What they found next was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Karen's breath caught in her throat as she stood in the clearing, the distant hum of the helicopter still in her ears, the thudding of her heartbeat drowning everything else out. She had been told Robert was alive. She had been shown the video, the undeniable proof. Now here she was, standing just a few feet away from the cabin where he had been hidden for 5 long months. The door creaked open slowly, and there he stood, Robert Donovan, her husband, the same man yet somehow not. His face was pale, drawn tight with strain, his eyes sunken, hollow. The man who had always greeted her with a smile and a warm embrace now stood before her, a shell of the man she had known. His clothes were ragged, torn, stained. His hair, once neatly kept, had grown wild, matted with dirt and grime. The sharpness of his features, once comforting and familiar, now seemed distant, almost unrecognizable. The warmth that should have come with their reunion, the relief she had anticipated, was gone. "Robert?" Her voice cracked as she took a hesitant step forward. Her heart ached, a part of her still clinging to the hope that this moment would feel like the others. Their reunions after trips, the comfort of his arms around her. But this was different. He didn't move at first. His gaze was distant, his eyes darting between her and the ground. Karen's hand reached out instinctively, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his arm. She wanted to hold him, to pull him into the embrace she had been waiting for, but something held her back. I can't believe it's really you," she whispered, her throat tightening with emotion. "You're back, Robert. You're alive." Robert swallowed hard, his eyes flickering with something that wasn't quite recognition but wasn't quite fear either. Slowly, he lifted his head, meeting her eyes for the briefest of moments. His lips parted, and for a moment, Karen thought he might say something. But instead, a choked sob escaped him, raw and desperate. His shoulders trembled as he sank to his knees, his hands clutching the dirt beneath him. Karen's breath hitched. "Robert!" she gasped, her voice sharp with panic. She rushed to him, dropping to her knees beside him. "What's wrong? What happened? Where's Eli?" Robert didn't answer right away. He just sobbed, the sound gut-wrenching and foreign to Karen's ears. He kept his face hidden, his hands shaking as he pressed them against his eyes, as if he could somehow erase the truth that lingered behind them. Karen pulled him close, trying to steady him, to offer comfort. But all she could do was watch helplessly as the man she loved broke down in her arms. "Where's Eli?" she repeated, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. "Please, Robert, tell me where he is." The words seemed to hang in the air, suspended by the fear that gripped Karen's chest. She pulled back slightly, her hands still on his shoulders, looking into his face for any hint of the man she once knew. Robert's eyes darted around the room, avoiding her gaze as if he couldn't bear to meet her eyes. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, his lips parted. He started, his voice raw and broken, but the words wouldn't come. He choked on them. His body shook harder, the sobs racking through him as he buried his face in his hands. I'm so sorry, Karen. I couldn't protect him. I couldn't save him. Karen's stomach twisted. What do you mean? What happened? Tell me. Please, Robert. His head shook violently, as though he couldn't bring himself to say it. I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Karen's mind raced. Something was terribly wrong. Her husband was not the man she had known. He wasn't just hiding in the wilderness for 5 months. He was hiding from something. From her. From the truth. The police had followed the trail from the video, reaching the cabin where Robert had been holed up, waiting in silence, avoiding contact with anyone. And when they arrived, they didn't just find a man trying to survive. They found a man who had been running from the truth of what had happened to Eli. And Karen knew, deep down, that Robert was hiding something far darker than anyone had anticipated. Something was buried in the silence between them. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than he was willing to admit. As the police moved into the cabin, their presence filled the space like an unspoken weight, pushing Karen to confront the reality she had tried so hard to avoid. They began questioning Robert, urging him to speak, but he only wept. And in those moments, Karen felt her own walls begin to crack. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that the man she had loved for years was still the same person. But how could she? Robert, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Where is Eli? Please, tell me the truth. I need to know what happened. He shook his head again, his eyes red and raw. I can't tell you. The officers exchanged looks, and Karen could feel the tension in the room tightening. Something was happening, something was shifting, and Karen could feel it, the edge of a revelation that would break her heart. The police insisted on searching the cabin again. They couldn't let this go. Something in Robert's behavior was off, something in the way he reacted to the questions. And as they combed through the small, secluded space, one officer pulled back a loose floorboard in the corner of the room. Beneath it, hidden from sight, was a small, shallow grave, discovered just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room. The officer's voice cut through the silence. Karen, he called softly, his voice strained. You need to come see this. Karen's heart stopped. She followed the officer to the corner, her legs shaky, her hands clammy. And there, beneath the floorboard, was something that made her blood run cold.
Aschalo grave.
The body was partially covered, the head of a child, her son, Eli, positioned carefully beside the torso. The macabre arrangement was not random. It was deliberate. Karen's breath came in short, desperate gasps as she knelt beside the grave.
No.
No, this can't be. This isn't real. She reached out, touching the dirt, the cold earth that had buried her son. Why, Robert? She cried, her voice breaking. Why did you do this? Robert could barely lift his head. His tears fell silently, his hands trembling as he shook his head. I didn't mean to. It was a mistake. It was supposed to be different. The police closed in, their eyes locked on him, as they began to piece together what had happened in the days leading up to the tragedy. They knew there was more to the story. Robert had been hiding, but now they had the evidence. The truth was staring them in the face. Why, Robert? Karen whispered again, her voice soft but filled with the weight of 1,000 questions. Why my son? Robert couldn't answer. He only cried, his body shaking uncontrollably. The truth was out. But it wasn't the reunion Karen had hoped for. It was far darker, far more twisted than she could have ever imagined. The officers began to move, radioing for backup, preparing to arrest Robert. But as Karen stood there, staring at the grave, she couldn't help but wonder what had happened to the man she had once known. What had driven him to commit such a horrific act? She wanted answers, but the answers she found only left more questions. The man she loved had done the unthinkable, and the darkness that had taken root in their lives was only beginning to unfold. The officers moved cautiously, following Robert's lead through the dense woods, their boots crunching against the snow. Karen walked beside them, her breath shallow and her eyes fixed on the ground. She had never imagined she would find herself here, standing at the threshold of something so grotesque. Robert, walking a few paces ahead, looked smaller than he ever had. The man she once knew, the man she had spent years with, was now reduced to a broken shell of himself. He walked with his shoulders hunched, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets, barely acknowledging the presence of anyone around him. "I didn't want to go back here," Robert muttered, his voice low and strained. "I shouldn't have brought you back here." Karen didn't respond, her throat tight, the words lodged somewhere deep inside. She couldn't bring herself to speak. What was there to say? What could she possibly say to him after everything that had happened? The silence between them was suffocating, and she longed for some explanation, some kind of comfort that would make sense of all this horror. But there was nothing. The officers stopped when Robert did, their eyes scanning the snow-covered ground, looking for any sign of something out of place. The area was desolate, the trees bare, their limbs heavy with snow. It was eerily quiet, as though even the wilderness itself had turned its back on them. "I buried him here," Robert said, his voice cracking as he motioned to a small patch of snow in front of them. He stood still, his feet rooted to the spot, as if he couldn't bear to take another step forward. Karen's heart raced, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. She didn't want to look, but she had to. She had to know. She needed to know the truth, no matter how unbearable it might be. Slowly, the officers moved forward, their shovels digging into the snow and dirt with methodical precision. At first, it seemed like just another patch of earth disturbed by the cold winds, a place where the snow had melted, revealing the hard, frozen ground beneath. But then the shovel hit something solid. There was a sharp, hollow thud, and the officers exchanged uneasy glances. "That's it," one of them said, his voice grim. He motioned for another officer to step forward, and they began to dig faster, working together in a coordinated rhythm. The snow piled up around them as the hole grew deeper. The moment the last layer of snow and dirt was removed, the officers stopped. The ground revealed what had been buried there, hidden beneath the cold earth. The sight was so grotesque, so out of place, that for a moment, no one moved. Karen's knees buckled, and she had to steady herself against a nearby tree, her eyes locked on the horrific discovery. It wasn't just a grave. It wasn't just a place where Robert had buried his son in a moment of despair. What they uncovered was far worse than anything Karen had ever imagined. It was a ritualistic arrangement, something dark and unsettling. A macabre display of the love Robert had once promised her. The body of Eli lay there, partially uncovered. His torso was intact, but his head was placed beside him, positioned with unsettling precision, as if someone had taken the time to carefully arrange it. His limbs were arranged in an unnatural way, as though they had been moved after death, the joints twisted and contorted. The body was dismembered, and yet, there was something almost ceremonial about the way it had been laid to rest. Karen couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. It was as though the ground beneath her had opened up, swallowing her whole. Her hands shook violently as she reached out, pressing them to her lips, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The officers were silent, their faces pale with shock. One of them pulled back, muttering under his breath, a few curse words slipping through his clenched teeth. Another officer knelt by the grave, carefully examining the body, his gloves stained with blood. "We need to get this to forensics," one of the officers said, his voice steady but laced with disbelief. "But this isn't an accident. This wasn't just a tragedy. This was something planned." Karen could hardly hear him over the deafening roar in her ears. Her son, her beautiful, innocent son. The thought of him lying there, his life stolen from him by the man she had trusted, was more than she could bear. She turned to Robert, her eyes wild with anguish. "Why?" she gasped, her voice cracking. "Why, Robert? Why did you do this?" Robert didn't answer at first. He stood frozen, his face ashen, his lips pressed tightly together, as though the words were caught in his throat. His chest heaved with each breath, his body trembling as he stared down at the grave, unable to look up at his wife. "I didn't want to." His voice was barely audible, thick with guilt and shame. "I didn't want to hurt him. I loved him, Karen. I thought it would work. I thought." His words faltered, his chest tightening with emotion, the weight of his own actions suffocating him. Karen took a step back, her knees weak. She couldn't look at him. She couldn't bear to look at the man who had done this to their son. The love she had once felt for him, faded, twisted, ruined by the truth that lay before them. "We need to get him out of here," one of the officers said, his voice firm as he turned to his team. But Karen couldn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the grave, from the horror that had been uncovered, from the monstrous reality of what had happened. "Robert," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "What happened to him? Why did you do this?" Robert's voice cracked as he spoke, his words tumbling out, broken and fragmented. "It wasn't supposed to go like this. It was supposed to make us rich. They promised me." "Who?" Karen interrupted, her voice rising with a new wave of panic. "Who promised you what?" Robert's eyes flickered with guilt, but he remained silent, his mouth working, as though he couldn't bring himself to say it. "They said if I gave them something I loved, something I cared about, they'd make me rich. I thought it would be worth it, Karen. I thought it was the only way out." "The cult?" Karen asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. "You joined a cult? You sacrificed our son?" Robert nodded, his face twisted in horror and regret. "I didn't want to. I didn't want this. I thought it would make everything better. I didn't know it would end like this." The officers moved forward, preparing to secure the scene, but the words hit Karen with a force that left her breathless. She felt her legs give way beneath her, and she collapsed to her knees, her hands clutching at the snow as tears streamed down her face. What kind of father does this to his own son? The question echoed in her mind, a haunting thought that would never leave her. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the frozen earth, her hands trembling as they traced the edges of Eli's broken body. She couldn't comprehend what had happened, how this man, the man she had loved, could do such a thing. The officers turned to Robert, their hands cuffing him, dragging him away from the grave, but Karen remained frozen, her mind reeling from the truth that had been revealed. The snow beneath her was cold, but the ache in her chest was colder still. The mystery of Eli's disappearance had finally been solved. But the truth, the dark, horrifying truth, was more than anyone could bear. The air in the interrogation room was thick with tension. Robert sat at the table, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking as though he were still caught in the same nightmare that had gripped him since that fateful day. He had been arrested, taken from the cabin where he had hidden himself for months. But now, in the sterile coldness of the police station, he was being forced to confront the unspeakable truth. Detective Marlowe sat across from him, his eyes narrowed, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "Robert, we need answers," he said, his voice steady, controlled. "You need to tell us why you did this. Why Eli? What happened?" Robert's sobs grew louder, his body trembling as if each word was too heavy to bear. His face was swollen from crying, his eyes red and bloodshot. His hands shook as he lifted them slightly, his fingers gripping the edge of the table like a lifeline. "I'm sorry," Robert whispered, his voice barely audible. "I never meant for any of this to happen. Please forgive me." Marlowe leaned forward, his voice hardening. "We can't forgive you, Robert. Not until we understand why. Why did you kill your son? Why did you do this?" But Robert didn't answer. He just sat there, shaking, his breath ragged, as though each breath was a struggle. The tears fell freely, soaking his shirt, but his lips stayed sealed, as if the words were locked inside him, too horrific to speak. Detective Williams, sitting beside Marlowe, exchanged a glance with him. They had been at this for hours. They had pressed Robert from every angle, trying to break through the silence that had consumed him. But no matter how many times they asked, no matter how many times they begged for an explanation, Robert's response remained the same. "I'm sorry," he repeated over and over. "Please, just forgive me." There was a long, drawn-out silence, the weight of the moment sinking deeper into the room. The detectives could feel it. The dark, suffocating presence of whatever truth Robert was holding back. They had to get to it, no matter the cost. But then, just as they were about to push further, the door to the interrogation room opened. The officer standing in the doorway cleared his throat. "There's someone here to speak with you," the officer said. Robert didn't look up. He didn't seem to care. But the detectives exchanged a look, a brief flicker of curiosity crossing their faces. They had no idea who could be showing up now. But when the officer stepped aside, an unexpected figure walked in. An old friend of Robert's, a man by the name of Tony Parker. Tony had known Robert for years. They had grown up together, shared hunting trips, and had long been close friends. But as Tony stepped into the room, his expression was one of grim determination. He had heard about Robert's arrest, about the discovery of Eli's body, and he knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. "Robert," Tony said quietly, his voice laced with a mix of sorrow and disbelief. He stepped closer to the table, his eyes locking onto Robert's face. "You need to tell them. You need to tell them everything." Robert lifted his head slightly, his gaze meeting Tony's for a brief moment. His face was pale, his features contorted in grief and confusion. "I didn't want to, Tony," Robert whispered. "I never wanted any of this." Tony sat down beside Robert, his hand resting gently on his friend's shoulder. The detectives watched in silence, their attention riveted on the two men. This was the moment. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. "Robert," Tony said softly, "you don't have to carry this alone. You've been hiding it for so long. But it's time to face the truth. You're not the same man I knew." Robert's eyes flickered with something darker, something deeper than just guilt. His voice was hoarse as he spoke again, this time with a hint of desperation. "I thought it would make everything better. I thought it would give me everything I ever wanted." Tony's face tightened as he glanced up at the detectives. "He told me about it," Tony continued, his voice low, almost hesitant. "The cult. He said they reached out to him, offered him power, wealth, everything. All he had to do was give them something he loved most." Tony's words hung in the air like a death sentence. The detectives leaned forward, their attention sharp as Tony continued. "He thought it was a sacrifice, some kind of ritual. He thought that by giving up Eli, by offering him to them, he would get everything he ever dreamed of. Power, money, the life he wanted." Tony paused, shaking his head in disbelief. But he was wrong, so wrong. Robert's body trembled, and his voice cracked as he finally spoke, the words coming out in a desperate rush. "I didn't want to. I didn't want to do it. But they promised me everything. Everything I had ever wanted. They said it was the only way. They told me I had to do it. For Eli. For us." The room was silent as Tony looked at the detectives, his face a mixture of sorrow and anger. "It wasn't an accident, was it? It wasn't some tragic mistake. Robert didn't lose control. He gave Eli away. He sacrificed him." The detectives exchanged a look, both of them shocked by the revelation. The pieces were falling into place, but the truth was more twisted than they could have imagined. Robert hadn't just been lost in the wilderness. He had deliberately taken his son's life, believing it was the only way to gain what he desired. It was cold-blooded murder, dressed up as a ritualistic sacrifice. Tony stood up slowly, his face pale as he glanced at Robert one last time. "I tried to stop him, but I couldn't. I never thought he would go through with it. But he did. And now it's too late." The room was still as the truth settled in. Robert's tears had stopped, his face devoid of emotion now, the numbness of guilt taking over. He had sacrificed his son to a cult, believing that power and wealth were worth more than the life of his child. And now all that remained was silence, the silence of a man who had lost everything, including his soul. The detectives were left with the stark reality. Robert's descent into darkness had not been a momentary lapse. It had been a gradual, deliberate choice, a path he had chosen willingly, all for the sake of something that could never fill the void inside him. "Do you have anything else to say, Robert?" Detective Marlowe asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. Robert didn't answer. He simply looked down at his hands, as though he were still trying to come to terms with what he had done. The detectives stood up, moving toward the door, their faces hardening with the weight of what had just been revealed. "Let's get him out of here," Detective Marlowe said. "This is far from over." As the door closed behind them, Robert remained alone in the room, his shoulders hunched in defeat. The man he had once been was gone, and in his place stood someone unrecognizable. Someone who had given everything for a dream that would never come true. The interrogation room was colder now. The air, thick with the weight of Robert's silence, seemed to press in on him from all sides. He sat hunched in his chair, his face buried in his hands, the remnants of tears still visible on his cheeks. The detectives had tried everything, questions, pressure, even the lie detector test. But Robert had refused to crack. He had denied everything, insisted that the story the police were piecing together didn't match up, that it wasn't true. The lie detector had told a different story. The test results were undeniable. Robert had lied, and the truth had slipped through his defenses. He had kept quiet, shielding whatever secret lurked in the recesses of his mind. But now it was time to face it. It was time for him to confront the darkness that had taken root in his soul. Detective Marlowe leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "We know what happened, Robert," he said, his voice firm, but with a hint of something else, something like pity. "We've already established that you're not being truthful. So now the question is, why? What were you really trying to cover up?" Robert didn't respond at first. His hands trembled slightly as he wiped his face, taking a slow, shuddering breath. He wasn't ready to speak. Not yet. He couldn't. The weight of the truth was crushing him, making it impossible to form the words. He had been holding it in for so long, pushing it down, pretending it wasn't there. But the floodgates had been opened now, and he knew he couldn't hold back much longer. "You've already lied to us, Robert," Detective Williams said, his tone hardening. "And we know you're hiding something even worse. The truth will come out one way or another. It always does." Robert shifted in his seat, his chest rising and falling as if he were trying to breathe through the suffocating reality of what he had done. He looked up, his eyes red and raw, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't want any of this to happen. I didn't want to hurt him." Marlowe's gaze softened, just a fraction, but his voice remained steady. "We need you to tell us what really happened, Robert. Why Eli? Why did you do this?" Robert let out a strangled sob, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if he could anchor himself to something, anything, to stop the overwhelming flood of emotions threatening to drown him. I thought it was the only way," Robert said, his voice breaking. "They promised me everything. Wealth, power. All I had to do was give them something. Something I loved." Karen's face flashed before him, her kind, loving face. His heart clenched at the thought of her, but the memories were already tainted, twisted by his actions. And Eli, his son, his blood, his own flesh, he couldn't bear to think of what he had done to him. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Robert continued, his sobs coming in ragged bursts. "I thought it was just a game. They said they could make everything better, that they could make me someone important. All I had to do was offer them a sacrifice. I thought I could do it. I thought he would be okay. I thought." His voice trailed off, lost in a sea of regret and despair. The detectives exchanged a look, but neither spoke. Robert's confession was like a slow-motion crash, each word more horrifying than the last. "It was a ritual," Robert choked out, his voice barely audible. "A cult. They told me I had to bring them something, someone I loved. Eli. He was the only one. I thought it would make me rich, powerful. I thought it was just a test, just something they wanted. But then they said I had to go through with it. And I couldn't back out." Marlowe's hand tightened into a fist as he leaned forward. "You killed your son for what? Power? Money?" Robert nodded, the tears streaming down his face. "I thought it was worth it. I thought everything would change if I did it. They promised me everything. But I was wrong. I lost him." His voice cracked on the last words, his body trembling as the weight of the confession bore down on him. He couldn't look at the officers now. His eyes were fixed on the floor, his hands twisted in his lap as though trying to hold himself together, but he knew he couldn't. The detectives exchanged a glance. They had known it would come to this, but hearing it from Robert, hearing the confession slip out, sent a chill down their spines. The truth wasn't just horrific. It was sickening. Robert hadn't been some victim of a tragic accident. as they had hoped. He hadn't simply made a bad decision. He had planned his son's death. He had offered Eli up to a cult, believing that by sacrificing his own flesh and blood, he would gain the wealth and power he had always craved. Marlowe took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. What kind of man does this to his own son? Robert didn't answer, his face crumpling as he finally broke under the pressure of his confession. His body shook with each sob, his words barely coherent as he muttered, "I didn't mean to. I thought they would help us. I thought it would all be better." But the detectives knew the truth now. The cult had promised him everything. Everything except redemption. Everything except forgiveness. Robert had sold his soul for a chance at wealth. And in doing so, he had destroyed everything that had ever mattered. His family, his son. And now, all that was left was a man broken by his own choices. A man who had killed the very person he was supposed to protect. The silence that followed Robert's confession was deafening. It was as if time had stopped, and the reality of what had happened settled in, leaving everyone in the room to contemplate the weight of his actions. Karen's face flashed in Robert's mind, but it was gone just as quickly. The guilt, the shame was too much for him to bear. He had thought he could escape, that he could make everything better. But now all that was left was the cold, hard truth. The room was still as Robert cried, each sob a testament to the loss he had brought upon himself. And as the detectives moved to arrest him, to take him away, he knew there would be no escaping the consequences of what he had done.
No Bealt.
No power.
No redemption.
Just the unbearable truth that he had given up his son for a lie. The cold clang of the cell door echoed in Robert's ears as he was led away from the interrogation room. His body, once strong and confident, now seemed to droop with every step, his hands shackled in front of him. He walked in silence, his head low, his eyes clouded with confusion, guilt, and despair. The man who had once been a father, a husband, was no longer recognizable. His entire existence had been reduced to this, an empty shell of the man he had been. Karen stood at the back of the courtroom, her face pale, her body rigid with grief. She hadn't moved since the trial began, her eyes fixed on the figure of Robert, sitting at the defendant's table, a man she once loved, the man she had once trusted with her life. But now all she saw was a stranger, a monster, cloaked in the same skin as her husband. The truth had shattered everything she had ever known. Robert wasn't the man she had spent years building a life with. He wasn't the loving father who had raised their son with care and affection. No, he was someone else now, a man who had given his son to a cult for the promise of power and wealth. A man who had slaughtered the very heart of their family for his own selfish desires. Every day in court felt like a battle, each moment of the trial another stab to her already broken heart. She had to sit there, hearing the details of Eli's death, how Robert had killed him, how he had betrayed him, all in the name of something so vile it almost didn't seem real. She had spent months imagining what could have happened, but hearing it from the mouth of the prosecution, hearing the truth laid out so starkly, it was something else entirely. It was worse than any nightmare she had ever had. The days of the trial blurred together for Karen. She sat in silence, her mind too shattered to grasp everything that was happening around her. The evidence, the testimonies, the way Robert would avoid her gaze every time the courtroom fell silent. Each piece chipped away at her soul. How could the man she loved do this? How could the father of their son, the man who had promised to protect and care for him, be capable of such horrors? Eli's face haunted her every moment. She saw it in her dreams. She saw it when she closed her eyes. His laughter, his innocence, his love for life. All of it stolen, ripped away by the man who had vowed to care for him. Karen could still remember the sound of his voice, the way he would run to her after school, his arms wide for a hug, his face beaming with joy. He had been everything she had ever wanted in a son. Smart, kind, full of life. And now he was gone. Gone at the hands of the very person who was supposed to protect him. Each day of the trial was another reminder of what she had lost. And with every passing moment, Karen's heart broke a little more. It wasn't until the final day of the trial that she could barely breathe. The judge stood, his face hard, his gaze unflinching as he looked down at Robert. The room was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Karen could hear the faintest hum in her ears, the weight of the moment bearing down on her. The judge began to speak. "Robert Donovan, you are hereby found guilty of the murder of your son, Eli Donovan, and the cover-up of his death. The evidence is clear, the facts undeniable. The court finds you responsible for the loss of a young life, a life taken in cold blood for selfish gain." Karen's heart raced, her hands trembling at her sides. She wanted to stand up, to scream at him, to demand an explanation, but she couldn't find the strength. She couldn't move. The man she had loved, the man she had built a life with, was now being condemned for the worst crime imaginable. And even though justice was being served, it didn't feel like enough. It would never be enough. The judge continued, his voice steady. "You will serve a life sentence without the possibility of parole." Karen's eyes welled with tears, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had hoped for this, had wished for it, but now that it was happening, it felt empty. Robert was going away, yes, but nothing could bring Eli back. Nothing could fix the broken pieces of her heart. She looked at Robert, her gaze locking onto his for the first time since the trial began. He didn't meet her eyes. He couldn't. His face was a mask of sorrow, but it was too late. The man she had known was gone. The man who had betrayed her, who had destroyed their family, was standing there, a shell of his former self. Her son would never be coming back. Nothing could change that. Karen wanted to scream, wanted to let the world know how much pain she was in. But the grief had consumed her, leaving her speechless. The world moved around her, but she remained frozen, her thoughts spinning. As the court adjourned and the officers led Robert away, Karen didn't move. She stayed seated, her hands gripping the sides of the chair as if she could anchor herself to something solid. The judge's words echoed in her mind. Life sentence. But what did that mean? What did justice really mean when it could never heal the wounds in her heart? What did it mean when Eli was gone forever, and Robert would never be the man she had once known? In the days that followed, Karen struggled with the aftermath. The world had moved on, but her life was frozen in time. She couldn't bear to return to their house. She couldn't bear the emptiness that now defined it. She stayed in a small apartment, surrounded by memories that were both beautiful and painful. The walls seemed to close in on her, each corner a reminder of what she had lost. She didn't want to be angry. She didn't want to hate Robert. But how could she forgive him? How could she ever look at him the same way again? Her son was dead, and Robert had taken him from her. But in the quiet of her apartment, in the silence of her grief, Karen came to a realization. Justice wasn't about the sentence. It wasn't about the courtrooms or the verdict. Justice was about remembering Eli. It was about the love she had for her son, the memories she held close, the laughter he had shared with her. Those things couldn't be taken from her. Those things were hers to keep forever. And though it didn't bring Eli back, Karen knew that she would keep his spirit alive. She would make sure that his memory lived on, no matter how hard it was. She would be the one to carry his light, to keep his name alive in a world that had taken so much from them. Justice for Eli would be more than just a sentence. It would be the love and memory of a boy who had been taken too soon. The town of Pine Ridge was quiet again, its streets slowly returning to their familiar rhythm as time wore on. Yet, beneath the surface of the everyday life that resumed, there lingered a heavy, unsettling presence. The trial of Robert Donovan, the man who had killed his own son in the most horrific way imaginable, had come to an end. Justice had been served, but the scars of what had happened would remain for years, maybe even generations. The memory of Eli Donovan haunted the town, not just because of the horrific crime, but because of what it represented. A son, a bright, innocent boy, murdered by the very person who was supposed to protect him, the person he had trusted most in the world. Robert Donovan's descent into darkness had come at the cost of everything that had once been pure in his life. His relationship with Karen, with Eli, with everything they had built together was all destroyed in the blink of an eye. The town couldn't quite shake the feeling that they had all been complicit in this tragedy. It wasn't just Robert who had failed. It was all of them, in a way. How could they have missed the signs? How could no one have seen what was unfolding in the shadows? How many others were out there, hidden in plain sight with dark desires and twisted motivations? These were the questions that now lingered in the minds of the people who had watched this case unfold. Karen, despite her grief, knew that she had to move forward. For Eli, her son, taken from her far too soon, had been the bright light in her life, and his memory would remain that light, even in the face of the darkest tragedy. She refused to let what Robert had done erase the joy that Eli had brought to their lives. Every corner of her apartment was filled with memories of him. His laughter, his love for life, the way he had run to her with open arms when she picked him up from school. She would hold on to those memories tightly, even as everything else around her seemed to crumble. But it was impossible for Karen to ignore the questions that still lingered. What had driven Robert to commit such an unthinkable act? The cult, the promise of wealth and power, had been his excuse. But what had he really hoped to gain? Power? Money? In the end, none of it mattered. He had sacrificed his own son for something fleeting, something that could never bring him the peace or happiness he sought. Robert had traded his humanity for a lie, and the consequences had been unimaginable. In the months that followed Robert's conviction, the town slowly began to heal, though the scars remained. People returned to their daily routines, children played in the streets, and the hum of life went on. But the shadow of what had happened would never leave Pine Ridge. The whispers in the corners, the glances exchanged when the subject of the Donovan family came up, those things would linger forever. And every so often, someone would look into the dark corners of their own lives and wonder if there was something, anything, that they were missing. Karen's grief was a constant companion, but so too was her resolve. She couldn't undo what had been done, and she couldn't bring Eli back. But she could ensure that his memory lived on. Every day, she told herself that she had to honor his life, that she had to live for him, even if it meant facing the horror of his death head-on. Eli deserved that, and so did the world around her. As time passed, Karen began to find a fragile sense of peace. It was not closure, for how could anyone truly close the door on such a wound? But it was something. She focused on her work, on the things that mattered most, on the friends who stood by her, on the family she had left, and on the memory of Eli. Every year on his birthday, she would light a candle in his memory, saying a prayer, whispering words she knew he would never hear again. It was all she could do. But for the rest of Pine Ridge, the legacy of Eli Donovan was more complicated. The case had shaken them, yes, but it also served as a reminder of the darkness that could hide beneath the surface of even the most familiar faces. Robert had been their neighbor. He had been one of them. And if he could do something so monstrous, what did that say about the rest of them? The townspeople couldn't help but wonder. How many others were there? People just like Robert, hiding behind the masks of normalcy, driven by dark desires, waiting for the right moment to act? What other horrors could be lurking in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered? As the years passed, these questions would never fully fade. The memory of Robert and Eli Donovan's tragedy would remain in the town's collective consciousness, a constant reminder that darkness could sometimes slip into the most unexpected places. And for Karen, the unanswered questions would stay with her, haunting her, as she lived with the legacy of her son's death. Justice had been served, but at what cost? Eli was gone, and Robert's fate was sealed. But the town and Karen were left to pick up the pieces. The story of Eli Donovan would be told, over and over, in whispers and memories. And the truth of his death, of what his father had done, would be remembered forever, a haunting reminder of how easily life could be destroyed by a single unforgivable choice.